So Díomh go léir, it's lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us. We're just letting people into the room. We had over 200 people register for this, but I know some are just coming from the Lifelong Learning in Pharmacy conference, and others are trying to fit this in the middle of their working day. Wherever you are in the world or whatever you're doing, you're very, very welcome to join us here this afternoon for us to take a moment to reflect on the journey of continuing professional development within Ireland. So Audrey, if I can ask you to share the slides. My name is Dr. Catriona Bradley. I'm the Executive Director of the Irish Institute of Pharmacy. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. And what we'd like to do is share with you some of the insights and information around our first 5 years of ePortfolio review in Ireland. And I will explain what that precisely means for any people who are joining us from abroad in just a moment. Just to give you a sense of how the day is, on the next slide we have the running order for this afternoon. So we're going to start with a brief welcome. I'm then passing over to Niall Byrne, who's the Registrar of the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland, the regulator for pharmacy in Ireland. Then Kate Mulvenna is the Chief Pharmacist in the Health Service Executive here in Ireland. And she will be talking to us about the delivery of health services and the role of continuing professional development. Colin Adair is joining us, Professor Colin Adair from Northern Ireland, to talk about the role of continuing professional development in pharmacy workforce development. And then I will come back briefly to set the context for this specific ePortfolio review journey before handing over to my colleagues Katherine and Sarah to talk about some of the learnings that we've had along our journey. So to start out, we're going to talk about continuing professional development. We all know how important it is in the role of pharmacy. I'm wondering now, are Niall's slides there, Audrey, or are they, because the running order is different on the initial slides?
Oh, bear with me.
So the journey that we've been on in 2010, the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland, and Niall can speak to this briefly, commissioned a report on a review of international CPD models. And it very much looked at what would be the right way to have continuing professional development supported within pharmacy in Ireland. There were now a number of concepts, and it ended up in a legislative definition of CPD being the systematic, self-directed, needs-based, outcomes-focused process of continuing learning for the benefit of patients. And therefore, that set us on a journey of reflective practice, and we moved away from continuing education, hours and credits, and instead to a journey of reflection, analysis, self-evaluation. I remember in the very early days, somebody from another partner profession saying to us that pharmacists reflecting, I'm not really sure that that's where we're going to be. It's, we're quite specific and objective, but actually the profession have done incredibly well and have embraced this in Ireland. And so we're very happy to give you some insights into the specific results from the last 5 years. But first, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Niall Byrne. He's the Registrar of the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland, our regulator. The PSI are the organisation who have commissioned the Irish Institute of Pharmacy. It's under contract for a 5-year period with the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, delivering on the statutory responsibilities of the PSI for continuing professional development in pharmacy. So Niall, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. And if I can invite you to share your thoughts on the role of continuing professional development in supporting the regulator in the protection of patients' interests and your perspectives on what's been achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catriona, and thank you very much for the invitation to come along this afternoon and to be part of the panel. I'm very happy to be here on behalf of PSI, the pharmacy regulator, and very much look forward to hearing the contributions of the other panelists. And if possible, if we have some questions and comments from members of our audience, I'm always very happy to hear feedback on anything that we do as regulator, but here today, that particularly on the very important area of CPD. So yeah, I have a few slides here, and you might click on there, Audrey, for me. Thank you. And you might click on to the next one. Thanks very much. So as Katherine says, I am the Registrar and Chief Officer of PSI. I've been in that role now for the last 5 years. So a lot of the work done by my predecessors, and indeed work that involved a wide range of people in the pharmacy sector here in Ireland and further afield as well, in terms of research and development work that was done going back all the way back to 2009, 2010. I suppose I was in the lucky position that I came along and a lot of the hard work had been done. So, so I've really been here to see the results of that work as the CPD system has come into operation over the last 5 years at this stage. So, so that's where I come in. So I probably can't really say a whole lot about way back there, but I do have some thoughts to share with people this afternoon. I only have 10 minutes, so I'll better move along on the importance though of CPD in patient care. And these are probably more, my thoughts than they are PSI's defined policy in these areas. The reflections, a couple of reflections from myself about, where CPD fits in. I mean, patient care is what all healthcare professionals are involved in. And, what do any of us want when we are patients in whatever setting that might be, or indeed people using, social care services, for example. It's not always about being a patient when one deals with healthcare professionals. So, my own strong view on this from my own background and experience. I'm not a pharmacist myself, but I have been involved in caring services going back in various capacities now over 20 years. So, my it's actually quite an obvious observation to make really is that people really are interested in two things. Number one, I want to be cared for, so I want the expertise of the healthcare professional to be available to me in relation to whatever it is that I might present with, whatever that might be. So that's the idea of being cared for, and that's obviously really, really important. And I want a competent professional, and I want somebody who's up to date, and I want somebody who understands their field. I want all of that knowledge and competence available to me. And what I also want though as well, and sometimes maybe this is more in the background, is I want to feel that I'm cared about also. So not just cared for, but cared about. And I think there's an important distinction here, and I won't labor too much this afternoon with the time available to us, but I will just cite a quotation there from Nell Noddings, who's a philosopher and has written extensively on this whole issue of what she would refer to as the ethics of care. So she makes the point that caring about is morally important because it's instrumental, as she would say, in establishing the conditions under which caring for can flourish. So what she's saying to us there is that, if I'm a healthcare professional, there's something about, I can't really care for you in the best way unless I care about you somehow. So caring about is sort of the vessel within which caring for happens. And myself, in my own experience, I found that to be very useful, that perspective. And Nell Nodding is very interesting. People may have come across her before. She was originally a scientist and a mathematician, and then she became involved in education, and then she developed a huge interest and extensive writings in relation to philosophy around care and caring, particularly in education. And she wrote extensively about the difference between a teacher who cares about the kids and a teacher who just teaches. And so it relates across to healthcare as well. So in terms of CPD, the role of CPD, our expectations on CPD are very high, aren't they? I mean, the public really does have high expectations. And in terms of patient care, I suppose the expectation and the role is that CPD will support and encourage healthcare professionals to be really competent in both these aspects of care, not just caring for, but have a very, very high awareness, I suppose, in terms of the importance of caring about. Now, there's a but. There's always a but, isn't there? So there's a big but with this, which is to do with the complexity of healthcare and the complexity of the relationships that happen within healthcare. So we could click on there, Audrey, thank you. So there's a lot of complexity. And I'm just going to illustrate the complexity just by reference to our own code of professional conduct for pharmacists. So our own code of conduct is up there in the top left-hand corner, and that has 7 principles in it. So if we just look very briefly at the first principle, which is put the patient first. Now, we all agree with that. Everyone would agree that's very important. We're all for that. There's nobody, I don't think, who's going to say I'm not about putting the patient first. In practice, of course, there are huge complexities. Some patients are easy, some patients not so easy. There's all kinds of things that get in the way of healthcare professionals putting the patient first. That's the reality. It's not easy. Time, deadlines, business goals, other kinds of competing pressures. I mean, we've seen people struggle extensively in all the healthcare and social care professions during the course of the pandemic. And all kinds of choices have had to be made, and not easy choices, difficult choices, ethically and morally difficult choices for people, difficult professional dilemmas. So there's all kinds of things that get in the way of this ideal of putting the patient first. And people are just human, and that's accepted, So, the expectations can be high, but it can be difficult for people in healthcare to live up to all these expectations. So, so is there some way to kind of, some kind of guidance through this moral maze? That'd be really helpful, wouldn't it? So, so the good news, and if you click on there, Audrey, thanks. The good news is, I think that, what, a CPD system can actually help. It can help navigate that maze. And these are some of the, the underlying benefits, the long-term strategic benefits to patients of an investment in high-quality CPD by a healthcare regulator. And we believe in PSI that that's what we have done. I'm not saying it's perfect or anything, but we do believe that we've invested in a system that can potentially be of enormous benefit. And I think we're seeing some of those benefits flow through in the last 5 years. So, if we just took 2 things that a CPD system could help with, well, the first is it could help counter this tendency that there is towards, a type of formulaic care. And Victor Montori is a very interesting guy, works in the Mayo Clinic, writes extensively about a patient and patient experience, encourages the idea of a patient revolt, that patients should revolt against industrialized systems of care. He makes the point that that kind of industrialized formulaic approach to care, what it does is it doesn't notice the patient. And it standardizes practices for patients like this, categorizing people into these more easily managed categories, rather than caring for this individual patient. Now, of course, we're all for individualized patient care, patient-centered care. I spent quite a few years very much involved in that. That's extremely difficult in practice. But I suppose Victor Montori is reminding us there that, yeah, it's easy. The easy route is to categorize people. The difficult route is to see people individually. So can CPD help us with that? I think it can. It can by reminding us, raising our awareness, and directing our attention, and reinforcing, I suppose, the expectation, and I suppose to an extent the requirement, that is actually what healthcare professionals should be doing, notice the patient. Maybe that's a better way to put it, rather than put the patient first, perhaps. That's only a thought. So can CPD help us then, help everyone on this webinar now who is themselves a registered healthcare professional, by promoting and, as you might say, valorizing the practices that notice the payment, the patient. And just another quote from Montori there, that, that kind of care, what would that look like? Well, what he says from his experience, and he writes, he's a very interesting writer on this, that's the kind of care that responds with competence, obviously critically important, science, so pharmacists very much people who come from the sciences in relation to pharmacy and pharmacy practice and knowledge of medicines, creativity, and humanity. If we were ticking those 4 boxes now every time that we encountered healthcare systems, and that's what we saw and experienced from healthcare professions, wouldn't that just be a fabulous thing? Wouldn't it just be fantastic? In order to advance, each patient's situation, and not to overwhelm people and not to create new ills, because I think we all know that healthcare systems can actually make people, worse off than they were initially. And there can be lots of bad outcomes from healthcare systems. So look, it's a big ask, I suppose, of a CPD system to do this, but I suppose that's the challenge. It's a collective challenge, and we've had a collective approach here in Ireland, as Catriona has said, going back now 2009, 2010. So we're on that journey. We're in that challenge. We're trying to grapple with these big questions. Have we made progress? Are we making progress? Have we solved any? I don't think we could say we've solved it. I don't know that it's even possible ever to solve these big questions. But the struggle, I suppose, the moral imperative, going back to Nell nodding, is what would a good person do? Well, a good person would keep struggling with the challenge, wouldn't they? And the good people like ourselves here all this afternoon, that we would continue in the struggle, even though the struggle is difficult. So next slide, Audrey, thanks. So where to next for CPD for pharmacists in Ireland? Well, just very briefly, the view of the PSI is that CPD is a critical component in how we work to ensure public trust in pharmacy through effective regulation. It's not an add-on, it's not a nice to have, it's not something off to the side. It's center stage, a critical component of the overall approach to regulation. We see it as a positive thing, not a negative thing, not a punitive thing. We see it as a positive thing, and the engagement that we see is actually very high, and we have travelled a very positive road over the last 5 years in relation to that, and that a lot of that's down to the work of the IIOP, Catriona, and all of our colleagues. We've made a strategic commitment in our current strategy, so that diagram to the right there sets out what our current strategic priorities are. And we will be completing a review of our current CPD model between now and the end of 2023. So we'll be learning, and we'll be looking at other systems. We'll be reviewing the evidence base, because I suppose a lot of the evidence base for the current system goes back at this stage 9-10 years, which is quite a while. So good to have a look back, build on the current strengths. Absolutely, there are some real strengths in the current system. Don't lose any of that. At the same time, agility, adaptability, sustainability, they're important considerations as well. So we'll be factoring in all of these into the review. And just to mention then, and it is an important part of our system here in Ireland, we're also, at the moment, we're reviewing our behaviour-based core competency framework. So that's an important part of how our whole CPD system works. So we're looking at the whole thing from that, I suppose, a joined up strategic overview, and our commitment then is to improve and develop the system, and to do that in as collaborative a way as we can. I think of just one more slide then, and I hope I'm not going too much over time, Catriona. Just by way of acknowledgement, yes, we absolutely acknowledge the contribution of everyone who's been part of the journey since 2012 and even earlier. And in particular, the IIOP, the Irish Institute of Pharmacy. I mean, the role the Institute has been, it's really kind of an understatement to say it's been pivotal in operationalizing the CPD system. I mean, there wouldn't be an operational CPD system if the IIOP hadn't done that work, and done that work to a very, very high standard, and very much engaged in the challenge, and continue to be engaged in the challenge. I think one of the things that the Institute has done very successfully is to promote the purpose of CPD across the pharmacy profession, and to help people understand what it's about, what it's not about, how it works, how it doesn't work, deal with some of the preconceptions that people may have had, and to help people understand where it fits in the grand scheme of things in a positive way. And of course, the many practicing pharmacists, there's a lot of people involved in the way that the system works. So there's a lot of involvement from pharmacists who contribute their own knowledge and experience to assisting their own colleagues, and to be part of a peer-led approach to CPD as well, which is something of real value. So we look forward to continued engagement with everybody involved as we proceed now with our CPD review, with that objective of supporting patient care over the coming years. So thanks very much for the opportunity. Just a few thoughts, and very happy to hear any comments later on from anybody. Thanks, Catriona.
Thank you very much, Niall. That is hugely appreciated and sets the scene very well for the role that continuing professional development plays in ensuring the care of the patients. And many of the participants have been on the Lifelong Learning in Pharmacy conference, and there has been a big theme about resilience and developing a patient-centered approach, and that idea of sticking with it, even if it's hard. That's what the reasonable person does. I think everybody in pharmacy takes incredibly seriously. So thank you to you for being here today, but also to the PSI in the implementation of the system. Clearly, there would be no CPD system without the PSI either, and it was the instrumental work of your team and predecessors and Lorraine Horgan and Down at Gahan that have allowed us to implement and operationalize the concepts that the PSI had established for the profession. So thank you very much for that and for your contribution today. As Niall said, it's the health system that patients are trying to navigate, and pharmacists have a role in that. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Kate Mulvenna. Kate was involved in CPD in many iterations before the Institute existed. She's always been there advocating for patients and really trying to make her best endeavours to ensure that competence and continuing development are at the core of what the profession is about. She has been our chair of our steering group since we were established and is the chair of our IIOP advisory group as it is now. So I think she's very well placed from an IIOP perspective to speak today, but also she is the head of pharmacy in the PCRS, the Primary Care Reimbursement Service in our health service, the Health Service Executive, the HSE in Ireland. So Kate, without further ado, may I pass over to you, please? Now, sorry, Kate, you're on mute there, so we've just missed that little bit.
Can you hear me now?
We can indeed. Welcome.
The key phrases in this COVID word, but anyway, in terms of thank you for the introduction. I have been very involved in the evolution between continuing education right through to the operation of the model that we're working with at the moment. Next slide, please. In terms of where we got to and where did we come from, as Niall said, in terms of the Pharmacy Act 2007, and the RCSI was a successful contractor for operationalising the CPD model. It's linked to an annual work plan, and there was serious consideration at the time when the HSE was working through the transition from its funding of the previous iteration, the ICCPE, which had been funded as part of the 96 contractor agreement. So an element of the core funding that the state put into CE in the beginning and is still supporting to a much lesser extent now, but at the same time that core funding was came from the negotiations of the contract at the time. And I suppose it means that there's been very much an ownership from the community pharmacy stakeholder group, because they remember the hard-fought monies to get a contribution from the state to their support for patients in the delivery of services. Next slide, please. And I suppose when the Institute was being thought of, was being developed as a concept, it very much was around a three-legged stool, that there would be the competence path, that there would be the leadership path and the supporting of the champions and the early adopters and how that could be done, and the research path. And that was very much around a holistic approach to continuing professional development, that it wouldn't just be the bread and butter of the mechanics of the competence assurance model, but that there would be other elements that would feed, help, support, and allow the CPD model to evolve constructively with other elements of with a true patient focus, but also with an understanding of what the profession needs as it walks through the different iterations of service models and the different elements of what life throws to us. And goodness, the last 2 years have shown us very much how we've had to adopt the way we deliver services. Next slides, please. So the competence path is around enhancing the capability within the profession to meet the emerging needs of patients in an evolving and complex health system. And that's our reality in any country in the world, that the complex interconnection between the service providers in different settings, that all those elements make a difference to the construct available. It was really important that there was a quality assurance, because there was a vision that this element of quality assurance would play a part in how service developments would evolve, would be paid for, and would be a part of the interaction with other professions in the service model development. So it's important to recognize that element of connectivity with the health service as a whole. Next slide, please. So in terms of the service development, so the training grant, what I would call an element of other funding that is available to pharmacies who have contracts with the HSE, that there was a training grant of the order of 1,600 a year. That was also negotiated as part of the agreement, because it was understood that it was important to give some support that could be delivered in a strategic manner in the context of what the health service wanted to have available to it. And it has been a disappointment, not alone to pharmacists up and down the country, but a disappointment to myself personally, in terms of that we haven't had as much traction on a new contractor agreement as was anticipated in recent years. For the last maybe 5 years, we have been considering what are the developments that would make sense. As Niall referenced, in terms of things are evolving, 9-10 years is quite a long time. It's at least 20 years since the last contract, and what should be in the envelope for a new contract. So in terms of the Institute, can I just move on to the next slide, please? In terms of what has the Institute do, and again, resonating with what Niall has talked about agility, I mean, at short notice at times, the Institute has responded very quickly to Department of Health requests. There are consistent requests coming from the HSE in terms of service support that would be of help as we deliver better and more focused services, particularly to marginalised groups or people for whom particular patient safety issues arise. In the round, what does the health service want from pharmacy? And I always focus in on that piece around maximising the benefits and minimising the risks. Pharmacists spend a lot of their time as an undergraduate learning those elements and learning how to explain those elements to patients. And it is a key competence that is what I would call unique to pharmacy. And while we absolutely need everybody to play their part in managing medicines within the health service, the pharmacist has a particular expertise around maximising the benefits and minimising the risks. And it is always a challenge for pharmacists who are in leadership positions to explain and try and navigate other people's understanding that medicines are not just about cost, but that the pharmacist adds a wraparound element about getting the best value, because the medicine that is used is, how the person uses the medicine is just as important as the medicine being available. So that element of wraparound that the pharmacist with their particular expertise brings is an important understanding to do our best to spread throughout the wider health system. And clearly, for any health service, chronic disease and the clinical care pathways, those elements are key to being efficient and effective in the delivery of care to groups of patients and to the individual patient. Again, going back to what Niall was saying about putting the patient themselves and how you deliver care to that individual patient being something that is an important element for the individual healthcare professional to always have front of mind. And again, we have this element of where can pharmacy fit in the overall patient journey? If you just move on to the next slide, please, in terms of how we maximize their value, how we reduce the duplication of effort. Next slide, please. How we ensure that as a health service, we know what each element of care is delivering, how they are all working together, how the information flow goes from one group of professional care to another group of professional care, with the patient in the middle and in the center. And the one area that strikes me as being ideal for further development in the Irish health system is around how we manage hypertension, which is a huge public health concern and is ideally placed to be well enabled and supported in community pharmacy and indeed in other settings through pharmacist delivered care, so that the other clinicians in the sphere can concentrate on more complex interventions. Next slide, please. So this is where I thought we would get to more over the last few years, in that we had a competency assurance system in place that was clearly delivering what it was asked to do, that pharmacists were pulled into reviews, that they delivered those, that they engaged in those reviews in a collaborative, constructive way, that was outcome focused, that had a particular concentration on what, rather than just learning and being able to show I spent 30 days doing A, B, and C, that the pharmacist was actually pushed along a route of thinking, well, how am I incorporating that into practice, into my service provision to individual clients? And where I thought we would get to, and I still hope to get to more, is that as we move towards a new pharmacy contract, that we consider what other services are required. But the system has to articulate what do we need. And the area that strikes me as being very evident is clozapine, in terms of that we are aware that it happens to find its way to community pharmacy delivery. But in fact, how do we want that done? How do we ensure that the hospital setting, the information flow, all elements are interlocking well together, such that the patient experience is enhanced, improved, and in fact, patient safety is also enhanced. But then we have to consider, how does the health service want to deliver the service? We need to have access to a suitable skills development molecule, and that's where locations such as the IIOP come in. We as a health service and as a payer would want to be satisfied that the module that people can access is fit for purpose, is doing and is underpinned by what I would call a robust review process. And then we would want to have that certified in such a way that if that was our choice, that we would be able to say, we want to see your certification before we would provide you with an enhanced level of funding for an enhanced level of service to a particular cohort of patients for whom we believe enhanced care is appropriate. So I suppose that particular slide is the nub of where I see everything fitting together, that the health service has a need because patients have needs, that there's a way by which the deliverer of enhanced level of service can be supported and enabled in a way that the health service can be assured that they are getting value, effectiveness of service in a uniform way, because that again is a challenge. That, you know, that element of uniformity is important, so that we can be satisfied that in a structured way delivery of service is assured. And that is where I leave you on that element, in terms of it has been quite a journey that has been a particular passion of mine for quite some time. I felt a little bit that it was a bit like a child and a toddler and moving through different stages, but it is a really good state of preparedness to go into the next review cycle of the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and I really appreciate that insight. It's really interesting to see the interplay between continuing professional development and upskilling, and the time being right for when the health services are needing the roles of pharmacists. And, you know, Alison Strath in the Lifelong Learning and Pharmacy Conference, the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer in Scotland, spoke about the fact that sometimes you need to wait till opportunities are in the right space and the right time, and preparation is useful. And I think what we have demonstrated is that pharmacists are ready and willing and happy to be quality assured, and are here in service of patients and of the health service. And I'd like to thank you for your very, I suppose, patient and steadfast support over the last number of years. And on a very personal note, I would have recounted to the conference in the last few days about how you've mentored me and helped me to adapt and understand the nuances that are involved at policy making level that I wouldn't have appreciated for the first year or two or more of being in the institute. And that's been part of my CPD and trying to adapt to those sorts of situations. So we're going to move now up the road to Professor Colin Adair, and this is the third stool to use, the third leg of the stool to use Kate's analogy of support for the Institute, because Colin has been so generous over the years and has been really so good at sharing his thoughts, because the CPE and the continuing education and continuing professional development was evolving as we were just thinking about it here in the South. And so Colin has been really helpful in explaining how continuing professional development needs to be part of workforce development in service of the regulation and in service of the health service. So Colin, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I wonder if you'd be willing to share some of your thoughts on the role of CPD within pharmacy.
Thank you very much, Catriona, and thank you for the welcome. Congratulations on reaching this milestone in your journey, and congratulations, I think, on what has become a superb organisation, and clearly a very joined up organisation in terms of the Irish Institute of Pharmacy, working with the health service to deliver patient outcomes. At our conference earlier today, someone said that you cannot say no to Catriona Bradley, and that's something that I can attest to as well. Catriona, I think we go back to about 2015, and she said, could we do some development work for the IIOP? And I said, I just don't have the time. So because she doesn't understand the term no, but she is collegial, she said, okay, if that timescale doesn't work for you, what would? And I think our relationship over the years has been extremely collegial, extremely friendly. So delighted to be here today. But if I could have my first slide, please. We're just looking at the role of CPD in pharmacy workforce development. And then if we just move on to the next one, which I want to look at just three things. Firstly, to review the current pharmacy training pathway, to describe the beginnings of workforce transformation, and then to outline the new continuum, the journey that we are really just commencing on in here in Northern Ireland, but actually in also the other countries within Great Britain. Could next slide, please. Well, our training pathway, I suppose, is as outlined on this slide. We have a 4-year MPharm, followed by a 1-year pre-registration year, and that's 5 years in total. Then after that, we have mandatory CPD. We developed this within NICPLD back in 2005, and then we passed the system on to the Pharmaceutical Society of Northern Ireland, the regulator who has responsibility for this. We have 4 stages in our cycle, and you have 5, but largely we're dealing with exactly the same thing. We would tend to have planning as 1, whereas I think you have planning as 2 stages. Portfolios are, we submit our portfolio every year. They are assessed, but only 5% or so are assessed. We don't know which 5% are being assessed, so it's important that our portfolio is appropriate. And they are scored particularly around reflecting in practice, reflecting on practice. And also important is evaluation. How have we been able to, action, how have we been able to translate our learning into practice? Has it been effective? Has it made a difference to patients? So that's our system as it was, and for many as it still is. If you could move on to the next slide. One of the, I suppose, issues that cropped up early in CPD, particularly coming from the hospital sector and primary care, was everybody was on their own journey. And from some employers' perspective, they find that not everyone progressed at the same pace, not everyone developed the same skills that were needed at any one time. And really they asked us the question, how can we bring consistency to the workplace? Because some, particularly early careers pharmacists, struggled with translating their learning into practical skills. And so if we move on to the next slide, this is really the system that we have developed now. I should say it is for early careers predominantly, and it is not universally taken up. At any one time, we have around 25% of the pharmacy workforce in Northern Ireland on this. So we still have our 4 years MPharm, our 1-year pre-registration. Then we developed 3 other programs: Foundation, Prescribing, and Advanced Practice. You can see Foundation's a 2-year program, Prescribing 1, and Advanced Practice 1 there. They all follow the same themes and thread. They're all experiential. So whilst there's some taught element of in this, they are largely practice-based. It works on reflective practice, reflecting in practice, reflecting on practice. It is about maintaining an ePortfolio that demonstrates your competency in practice, your evolving competency in practice. We're very much dependent on reflecting. And they're all based on curricula and frameworks. The important part that they have a support infrastructure. So for example, the earliest years, those on Foundation, usually newly qualified or very, very early years, would work with an educational supervisor. That's quite a close-knit relationship. Moving on to then from that into prescribing. They'd work with a designated prescribing practitioner, usually a medic. That's more oversight, but slightly more of a distance. And then those moving beyond that into advanced practice, working more remotely, shall we say, almost more autonomously within practice, but certainly working with a mentor that will guide them through their advanced practice development. And certainly I'm not going to go into this now, we don't have time, but my colleague who manages the Foundation program has done work that demonstrate this Foundation is highly effective at enabling individuals to translate their learning into practice, to become more competent. They practice at a higher level. And they do that much earlier in their professional journey than those who haven't gone through this type of program. So it is effective. Now, if you could move on to the next slide, please. There are a few problems with it. As I said before, uptake at any one time is around 25%. So it is selective. And largely it has tended, not exclusively, but tend to be confined to hospital practice and to those pharmacists working in general practice. Another difficulty, of course, is it's quite lengthy. We've got 5 years MPharm and pre-registration, and then on top of that, we've got a further 4 years minimum in order to train to advanced practice level. And certainly it's 8 years to become a prescriber from entry into the MPharm program, which is a very long period of time. In fact, for most people, it tends to be a little bit longer than that by the time they actually are certified within their hospital or within their practice to prescribe. I suppose one of our disappointment for me, but also looking across the wider UK, is that there has been limited progress, particularly around prescribing. Around 25% of the pharmacy workforce are prescribers. That's actually quite good. Scotland's a little bit better than us, and if we look at England, I think it's around 17%. So prescribing has been in place now, well, since about, in its current form, 2006, when we began all of these programs. So a little bit disappointing we haven't made more progress on prescribing. And that very often, coming back to what we talked about in the Lifelong Learning Conference, is around policy development and new universal prescribing services that pharmacists, particularly those in community pharmacy, can engage with for the betterment of and better management of their patients. If I could move on to the next slide then, please. So there is a new training continuum that has been proposed by both regulators, the General Pharmaceutical Council and GB, and the Pharmaceutical Society of Northern Ireland. They propose a reform to the MPharm, and then the pre-registration year would be replaced by a foundation training year. And both these 5 years are underpinned by the same learning outcomes. The difference is, of course, that most of the learning outcomes, so all of the learning outcomes during the foundation training year will be at the DAWS level. So that's actually putting that into practice. Only 17 of the 52 or so learning outcomes at undergraduate will be assessed at the DAWS level. But there is the same learning outcomes. There's a continuum of learning. And importantly, and I think it is very aspirational, is that all of those completing the foundation training year, which will be all pharmacists, will be prescribers at the point of registration. And I think that gets back to a previous point I made, that this progress universally across pharmacy in enabling us to be prescribers has been quite slow. And this has been brought about by COVID and about the quite fragile nature of our health service when we're faced like major issues such as COVID. I'm sure COVID will not be the last of these. So how can actually we better realign our services to better manage and work for patients for better outcomes? So this is the journey we're on. We haven't fully, I suppose, addressed exactly how we're going to get there. It will take us some years to do that. It's certainly well recognised that we will need to support those newly qualified prescribers by some mechanism. Whether that's formal or whether that is voluntary remains to be seen. And then, because we're translating everyone onto the prescribing pathway, we need to be looking about how we actually more consistently develop our workforce to advanced practice. One of the deficits at the minute of our current system is that a lot of this is linked into formal university programs, typically a master's and so forth, and they tend to be quite focused on timescales. I think as when we progress to advanced practice, we want to maybe get away from university programs and more looking at perhaps a longer term development to advanced practice, which not everyone is ready to progress to advanced practice at the same time. And there will be a group beyond that still who may wish to progress to consultant level. Again, that's a longer time scale still. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Our aspiration, I suppose, is that we want to transform the culture across the profession of pharmacy. Oh, if we could just go back one, that's it. Recognize the diversity of practice, that these pathways are not just for hospital general practice, but they're actually for all aspects, particularly community pharmacy, which makes up 60% of our profession. To provide career seamless development from undergrad to foundation as a prescriber, and then through to advanced practice, which becomes the normal career development pathway and a roadmap for everyone. Something I've been thinking about a lot is we do need maybe a better infrastructure to support our trainees. We need to support the development of our educational supervisor network. I think that's one of my priorities. And then just moving across to the last slide. Succession planning is something I think we don't do very well at all. Looking across at our very senior people within pharmacy, in the public sector, private sector, in government, they're all of a certain age, and you need to be careful how you categorize people, particularly as being recorded, but probably somewhere between early to mid 50s. That means, I think, in a very few years, a lot of those people will be retiring. How do I actually plan for succession? How do we undertake succession planning? It's something we don't do very well. We need to think about this. I think the fellowship schemes are useful. It's something we would like to implement. Maybe taking people out of the pharmacy domain for a period of time, working more closely with government, whether it's workforce policy, whether it's finance and the planning of finance, looking at the development of health policy. How do we actually do that? So it's not an echo chamber of pharmacy, but it's getting these senior leaders in waiting to see the much bigger picture across government about the structures and infrastructure of a country that will impact on the delivery of health and on healthcare services. So, Catriona, thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't overrun too much. Happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Colin. And it's wonderful that you can share all of that progression. And it's easy to look at a slide like that and think, wow, you know, they have it all sorted up north. I know that that took lots of planning, and it evolved and it happened over time. And one of the things that I've always found so wonderful about working with Colin is he's really helped me to raise my gaze, and although we may not have the same health system or the same parameters just now, there's no doubt, going back to what Niall and Kate said, there's some things that we know are needed. We know that focus on patient is required. We know that new services are required. We know that we will be ready if and when they happen. And we know we need resilience and grit to wait until the right time, as well as being proactive about helping others to understand the necessity of managing medicines. So I hope that's provided people with an overview of how continuing professional development may sound like something that's, you know, nice to do, but it's an essential to do. And we have managed, the profession have managed to really demonstrate their commitment to that in the last 5 years. I'm going to hand over to my colleagues in the IIOP to explain a little bit about what's happened. So to set the context, ePortfolio and ePortfolio review, which is what we're marking today, is where pharmacists 20% every year submit their portfolio for review. And it's a reflective portfolio, a little like what Colin was talking about. There are also other factors and other quality assurance measures. Practice review looks at quality assurance at the practitioner level, and the education accreditation looks after quality assurance at the provider level. The ePortfolio review encourages and assesses quality assurers pharmacists' involvement proactively in ePortfolio, in continuing professional development, in line with the legislation. So we've had to have pharmacists demonstrating that it's ongoing, it's systematic, cyclical, needs-based, outcomes-focused. Quite a challenge. And in order to address that challenge, we turned to the profession, having taken the direction from the health service, from the regulator, from the legislation. We turned to the profession, and Katherine is going to, my colleague, the operations director in the Institute, is going to talk a little bit about that journey of how we engaged and sought the input of the profession. So welcome, Katherine. It's lovely to have you presenting.
Thank you. So Audrey, can we go to the next slide? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, well, the CPD rules legislation of 2015 did bring significant change for pharmacists in terms of professional governance. And the adoption of the CPD model by the profession wasn't necessarily all plain sailing. And I think initially it is fair to say there were some levels of worry and some trepidation. And I think it's easy to understand why. I mean, what would it mean? How would we fit it in? What if it wasn't good enough? Aren't we regulated enough already? So here in the IIOP, we needed to think about how we would get the buy-in of the profession, allow pharmacists to see, I suppose, the value of CPD and also realize the benefits. We wanted to facilitate a CPD system that at its core supports our patients and is responsive to evolving healthcare needs. I mean, that was vital. So one of the key strategies that we adopted, which was supported by the legislation, was to take an inclusive peer-led approach, underpinned by the full rigor of a robust quality framework, with the aim of making the CPD model valid, reliable, transparent, and accessible. So Audrey, if you can go to the next slide for me. So what did we do? We decided to ask for help from the profession. So we sent out expressions of interest. We did this by email to all the pharmacists on the register. We invited them to get involved in the shaping of this new CPD model and by helping us spread a positive message about CPD. We were careful to use a positive tone to convey the benefits of participation and also to dispel any misconceptions around this being, a closed shop. it was important to us that all pharmacists were represented and included, which included those who were initially critical or perhaps apprehensive in relation to the new model. Audrey, if you can move on, please. So we had no idea what the response would be. I mean, would anybody even come forward? The reality is, actually, we were quite overwhelmed. Pharmacists along the length and breadth of the country put up their hands to be involved. And even at the very first pilot, we had over 130 pharmacists express their interest to participate. And the numbers have grown steadily since, actually. I mean, such was the enthusiasm from the very beginning of moving the profession forward and also of advancing standards. Next slide, please, Audrey. And just some pictorial evidence, if you like, as to the success of our recruitment. We are, so very appreciative of the support and enthusiasm of our colleagues in the profession. You can move on there, Audrey, please. Okay, so maybe just give you a flavour of how exactly our peer colleagues got involved in ePortfolio review. So there were three key areas where we adopted a peer-led approach, supported by a robust governance framework to ensure the validity and reliability. First was around standard setting, so establishing the parameters under which the CPD would be evaluated. The remit of the standard setting group was to set standards for the review, which would set the minimum requirements for pharmacists to demonstrate reasonable and practical engagement with CPD, whilst incorporating all of the legislative requirements. Effectively, the profession were, and actually continue to be, setting the standards and benchmarking themselves. Secondly, peer reviewers were integral to the review and assessment process. So these peer review pharmacists underwent training and assessment to ensure that their approach to each ePortfolio was consistent and standardized. So over the last 5 years, at least 20% of submitted ePortfolio extracts have been reviewed by a peer pharmacist, and the results of these qualitative reviews have tracked extremely closely to the quantitative results generated by the system. And then finally, we have the peer-to-peer support for pharmacists, so support when they're recording and submitting their CPD. We convened a coalition of what we call peer support pharmacists, or PSPs, who delivered and facilitated information workshops across the length and breadth of Ireland. Our PSPs really are ambassadors for CPD, and they also provide a two-way conduit of information between the profession and the IIOP. So just by way of conclusion, the pharmacy profession was integral to the implementation of the CPD model in Ireland. It's been guided every step of the way by peer pharmacists who have steered us both in our adoption and our approach. Thanks, Catriona. Back over to you.
Thank you very much. And so I think what we've heard there is that the profession were instrumental in this. We went and asked what would be required from a CPD system or ePortfolio review, and we were able to hold that tension between engagement with the profession and enabling them to meet the standards and help us to create systems that had robust standards within them. And that's really the appropriate, the way to get the appropriate level of regulation and engagement. And sometimes it can be down to something as simple as how the ePortfolio looked, and it did enhance engagement when it was very much focused on the user, yet incorporating the principles of quality assurance and the regulatory adherence. So Sarah is going to finally provide us with an overview of the outcomes. We've been on this journey for the past 5 years. In 2015, the profession were generally undertaking continuing education, which was often in response to whatever the continuing education program was available at that time. We've moved to a reflective model, and Sarah will give you some of the overview. Will give you an overview of some of the insights on that. So Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Catriona. So as Catriona said, after our first 5-year cycle of the ePortfolio review process, I'm delighted to be here with you today to share some of the outcomes and some of the insights that we found. So next slide, please, Audrey. Over 5,000 portfolios were reviewed over the 5-year period. As you can see from the graphs here, there's consistently high levels of engagement each year, over 95%, and consistently high percentages of pharmacists reaching the required standard as well. So it is evident that Irish pharmacists are committed to their continuing professional development in the interest of patient care. Next slide, please, Audrey. I know we have an international audience with us today, so for those of you who may not be familiar with the system itself, this is what it looks like. It's an online ePortfolio that supports systematic, outcomes-focused, needs-based CPD with a particular focus on impact on practice. And you can see pharmacists are guided through each stage of the cycle. And now we can see some trends across how pharmacy is engaging with CPD in these different stages of the cycles over the past 5 years. So next slide, please, Audrey. I'd like to share with you some of the trends that we're seeing. How are pharmacists learning? What's going on? How are people identifying their learning needs? And how are they going about tackling those learning needs or developmental needs? Now, I'd like to acknowledge that we can't say that this is a complete learning. What it is it's the learning that pharmacists are recording. And I'm sure there's so much more learning happening outside of what's been recorded too, but here what we have is the overall ePortfolio trends to share with you. We can see that the top 3 ways in which pharmacists are identifying their learning or developmental needs are self-reflection, dealing with issues that arose in the workplace, and talking with peers or other healthcare professionals. What learning resources do they consider as they go about addressing these needs? They plan to talk to their colleagues about it and do research, whether that's through literature and journals or articles on the topic. And what we can see is that there is more on-the-job learning recorded than those using resources that are maybe more structured or accredited learning resources. Most importantly, what impact is this learning or development having on practice? The top 3 recorded impacts in practice have been improved performance in role, improved care for patient, and improved confidence. And as pharmacists, and as each of our speakers have spoken to already today, that is what we all work towards, patient care. I know Catriona will be keen to come back to this slide and share her insights a little bit later. But finally, to close for me, I want to share with you a few messages that our pharmacists have sent to us following participation in the ePortfolio review. And we have a snapshot of some of the feedback that we've heard from pharmacists. One thing, all practicing pharmacists have always done CPD. All that's changed now is how we record it. Some found it easier to record than they thought. Others found it was maybe tedious or repetitive. Some pharmacists struggled a little bit with the reflective practice component, saying that as pharmacists, we think logically. There's an awful lot of self-reflection, which they personally felt was a little bit wishy-washy. While another said they'd realised the opportunity to align their CPD much more into their everyday work and life, and that it helped them to be more constructively reflective. So I just want to take a minute to thank all the pharmacists who took the time to provide us with feedback and encourage you to continue to do so going forward. So I'll hand back to you, Catriona.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'd like to add my thanks. I have already expressed my gratitude to the PSI, to the HSC, to Colin, to the profession. They have really engaged and shared their wisdom generously. The peer support has been amazing. But finally, to the colleagues in the Irish Institute of Pharmacy, they have really adopted the concept of supporting and enabling whilst assuring quality, and I've really appreciated their support. This sort of an event, what are we actually trying to achieve? I think it's important to mark an occasion, which is we have achieved this over the first 5 years. There were people who said that we shouldn't do it so quickly, that there were other jurisdictions that had integrated it over a much longer period. We did it. We have no fears of CPD or of reflection of learning. We actually enjoy and understand the need for quality assurance on behalf of patients in the health service. So I think that needs to be acknowledged, and I would do that today for all my pharmacy colleagues within Ireland. Going back to that slide that Sarah had shown us, and if you know, Audrey, if you go forward, I think this review insights. This is really interesting to me. When we started with the Institute and asked people how did they learn, it generally was continuing education events. It generally was in response to whatever the agenda was that was being held in the local area. It generally was not focused on the impact on practice, but rather developing the accruing the benefits or the credits. I often told the story in the beginning of how a pharmacist, I saw them at 3 different events that I was delivering, all on ostomy products, the same event 3 times, 3 nights in a row. And I asked, had I been unclear? And this was all along the west coast of Ireland. And I was told, no, 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 I'm just getting my hours built up for the end of the year. That wasn't the approach that is in service of patients, but it was an incentivization for building hours. Now we have an incentivization for building reflection. And we've just come from a conference that has really focused on how important it is, but how difficult it is to do that. And so it is really gratifying to look at this slide and realize that through self-reflection, and by having self-reflection included in the legislation, the statutory instrument that had been developed and supported by the PSI, reflection is now central to our continuing professional development, and that we are managing the issues and reflecting on them as they arise during work. And it's also good to see that how we think we're going to plan our learning isn't always how we do it. But Colin has often spoken about the move in Northern Ireland from continuing education to work-based development, and that is the way we're going. What we have done, we have prepared, and the profession have stepped up to say, yes, we are prepared to evaluate, to reflect, and to evolve. And that means that we are ready to embrace the challenges of patient care in the future. And we've demonstrated our worth over the COVID period. But we can see that we can be assured of pharmacist engagement in quality. Like Sarah says, this isn't necessarily the full picture. It is what people have recorded, but I think it does give a barometer reading or a touch point. So going on to the next slide, we are coming to and have passed the end of the session. What we had hoped and we shared with pharmacists in the beginning was that this, for that first 5-year period, was to get everybody on the same road so we could quality assure that everybody was engaging in their continuing education and continuing professional development to the same level. Some people further along on the path, they've gone into advanced practice or specialization. But what we would hope is that now that the profession have demonstrated their commitment in a very authentic way, there should be options and choices on the road ahead. That's what's happening in other jurisdictions, and it is something that we would welcome because continuing professional development needs to support development of the profession as much as the individual. Pharmacists have demonstrated their individual commitment, and so we would like to be part of the discussions in considering how the pharmacy profession could in turn benefit from that development and evolve. I think that's the last slide, and it just remains for me to thank people. I would love to have a discussion. Now, I am aware, and being respectful of people's time, we are 7 minutes over the allocated time. I think it was time well spent. I'm really grateful to the speakers today who've taken time out of their schedule to share with us. I will perhaps just say we can leave it there. I'm just trying to look at the comments and the questions, and I think there's quite a number of questions that we will take from the comment box and endeavour to reply. But I think the sense of the comments I've seen is that there needs to be an understanding of the complexity of the pharmacist role. It would be great if we could play more of an active role in the health service. From international speakers, this isn't just an Irish issue in general. Pharmacy can sometimes struggle in having its value articulated, and there we really do want to focus on continuing to be part of that. Kate Martin's comment here is that Kate Mulvenna's focus on the benefits and risks of medicines fits well with the idea of collaboration between pharmacists and prescribers, and as Liz says, adjusting prescribing medicines and prescriptions. I am sorry that we didn't have more time for discussion, but we would look at this as a conversation opener. And in the same way, I want to just briefly mention the resilience podcast. I think it's on the next, this has been launched today. It's on Apple and it's on any of your wherever you do your listening, Spotify. This is again another part of continuing professional development where some of our pharmacists felt that the act of reflecting on tough times or difficult issues were of real benefit in their personal development and professional development. And they share their stories very generously and authentically in another aspect of continuing professional development. So I'd encourage you to have a listen to that, and thank you to the people who participated. So it only remains for me to say thank you, Gurv Mogwiv. Thank you very much for your attendance and participation today. We did try to get the balance right between not taking too much time out of people's agendas and yet at the same time giving some space to acknowledging what has been achieved. There were some pharmacists on forums who felt that 2 o'clock on the last day of the month was a shocking time, and it is, but at the same time we wanted to coincide with lifelong learning and we wanted to have speakers and available. So my apologies for those who are looking at this as a recording. We're sorry you couldn't join us, and we will mark it again within the profession as well. But for now, I think it's a job well done. Pharmacists should acknowledge for themselves and across the profession that they have achieved a lot in this first year period. And thank you very much, everybody, for staying with us, notwithstanding the fact that we went a little bit over. Thank you to our speakers today, to Niall, to Kate, to Colin, to Sarah, to Katherine. I really appreciate everything you've done in getting us to this point in the journey, and I look forward to the next steps that lie ahead. Gurv Mogwiv, Slán go fóill.